Hi, it's Mike from Mike's Unboxing Reviews and How To, and on today's video we'll be taking a look at the Radeon RX470, what is now 7-year-old graphics card. This one was kindly donated to us, to the channel, by our good friend Skystalker, and if you've watched yesterday's video you'll see that this was one of those cards that had to be recovered from a BIOS flash, so if you want to check that out, please do in advance. Then you'll know what this is all about. So effectively what we're going to do today, now that the card is actually working, so spoiler alert if you haven't watched yesterday's video, anyway, I digress. So this is a 6 or 7-year-old graphics card now. We don't really know the entire history of it. It was bought used by Skystalker as well, so he's not entirely sure of the entire history of it, but I thought it would be good practice to actually go through, do some cleanup on this, change the thermal paste, just see what's going on inside, make sure that there isn't too much gunk in there, and then we're going to do some tests on the system behind me and actually get some numbers on this thing and see how well or badly it performs in 2023. So let's get straight into it. Now when you're actually doing some work with a graphics card in terms of cleanup, etc., there's a few things which you can have on hand which will make life a lot easier. Magnifying glass potentially, so if you're slightly visually impaired, it might be a little bit useful. Some of the screws can be a little bit small. Other things, obviously, selection of cross-headed screwdrivers. You also a toothbrush, which I've probably pronounced wrong, or for some people you've got triggered by that, but this is a brush for cleaning your teeth, and this is actually really good for removing thermal paste, in conjunction with some isopropyl alcohol. I've actually got this in a little spray bottle so you can easily apply it rather than using kind of cotton buds, that sort of stuff. So that's a really good way of doing it, and obviously you don't need to use as much because you can get a little bit more control over where you're actually spraying the isopropyl alcohol. If you don't have isopropyl alcohol, you can use other things. Potentially you could use alcohol-based aftershaves. Those are relatively good for breaking down thermal paste. Not ideal, but certainly in a pinch you can use it. Something else which is going to be handy as well is a little bit of shop roll or blue roll, whatever you want to call it, just for obviously mopping up and doing some additional cleaning. Clearly you will also need potentially other things such as thermal paste. We're going to be using some Noctua paste in this particular instance, as it's a little bit thicker than some of the other pastes on the market, so it does do a really good job of kind of filling out the voids in the gaps. One thing with actually trying to cool a core which is exposed is you do want to get the best coverage possible, so using a slightly thicker paste can be advantageous. I have found in the past that using particularly thin pastes, even if you do spread them very well, due to the kind of tolerances that you've got where you're actually putting basically a cooler slap bang on top of a die, doesn't always line up entirely, and maybe you've got your mounting pressure slightly off, so using a thicker paste will certainly help there as well. So with all that said, let's get on with it. So here we are, here is the graphics card. I've put down just a microfiber towel just to protect it slightly. Depending on your graphics card, this may be a little bit easier or a little bit more difficult, a few more screws, etc., but the kind of the basic principle is the same. So you can look on the ends for any screws which may be holding your cooler in place. Otherwise, just a case of flipping it over and taking a look at the back side. I have actually undone the screws on here a little bit already just to make sure they weren't too tightly fastened. And in this particular instance, it's actually really straightforward. We've only got 4 real screws to do. With these, really, I suppose you should undo them equally as you go through. But to be honest with you, the paste on here is pretty old and probably quite flaky already, so I don't think it's going to be a problem. So just go ahead and undo the retaining screws, which are the main ones for the core, or the core cooler. So there's your 4 screws. Put those somewhere safe just so that you've got them to hand for later on. And in this particular instance, that is pretty much all we need to do. The cooler should actually come away. Oh, there we go. It's actually fallen off already. So we can just move that around to the side. And there you can see what we're dealing with. So there is the core. So you've got your memory chips, etc. Not a great deal on this board. A lot of spare space there where you could put more RAM, that sort of stuff. But this is only the 4 gig model, so we don't have a lot else there. And looking at the actual top section itself, the cooler, you can see it's only a single heat pipe on this one. Quite a chunky heat pipe. I think that's an 8mm one. And the actual pads themselves look okay. Some of the RAM on here isn't completely covered, but it does touch very slightly on there, as you can see. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 chips there to make up our 4 gigabytes. And yeah, that one there I think is the one which is kind of barely covered. But it seems to work, and it's obviously been working at some point. There's a little bit of dust on here, so let's go ahead and get a paintbrush I'm just going to give it a gentle wipe over, just remove the majority of that dust just to get it off of there. Ideally, if you can, try to use a brush which is static free. This is a relatively inexpensive graphics card, so we're not particularly concerned about static in this particular instance, but obviously if you are concerned, then make sure you've got yourself an anti-static strip or buy yourself a anti-static brush. I'll try and link some of those in the video description, so if you do want to pick up any of those items, you certainly can do, along with things like the isopropyl alcohol, etc. And already you can see that is a lot better. A little bit there I've missed. Hard to see in this particular setup because of the angle the camera's on, etc. But that is the majority of it gone. So what we want to do now is to remove some of this thermal paste, which is actually on the core there. So what we're going to do is going to get some of our shop towel. I'm just gently going to rub some of that off. We should be able to get rid of most of it. Actually, it does look like it's in pretty good condition. So once you've used some, just fold over your towel and you can go ahead and try and remove the rest. Now, some of this around the outside edges, as you can see, is on there pretty good. So what we're going to do is we're going to just get a little bit of our isopropyl alcohol, spray a little bit on there, not too much, and then we're going to use our brush for cleaning teeth and just going to agitate it a little bit. Just be gentle because this is an exposed core and potentially you could damage things, so do be careful. You don't want to remove any of these surface mounted capacitors or diodes or whatever they are, so just be a little bit careful. If need be, keep on applying isopropyl alcohol to break down the thermal paste there. If you want to as well, you can use a small piece of plastic or something, such as the spludgers, which are included with a lot of thermal paste, and you can gently remove that. See, with the isopropyl alcohol in there, it's made it a little bit easier, so we can pick that off and just rub it off onto our cloth. Sometimes these plastic spludgers actually do a really good job of it. Yeah, that's done really well. I don't always want to touch it, but in this instance that does get it off quite well. And just that last section over there. To be honest with you, this doesn't really make a great deal of difference. This is just for neatness, really. If it's the old paste is on there, isn't too much of a problem. The spludger also makes a handy little shovel. So there we go. I think that's considerably better, so we can give that another little rub down. With our brush, and yeah, that looks absolutely great. So now I'm going to get another piece of shop towel. I'm just going to absorb up any additional moisture. Being that this is isopropyl alcohol, it will actually evaporate anyway, so you don't have to worry too much. Obviously, don't drown it in the stuff if you can help it. And again, be careful around all of these surface mounted capacitors and diodes and things like that. So I think that is pretty much it. Not really anything else we need to do here. If you want to, for sort of the sake of it, you can just give the board a light spritz in. And again, go over with your brush just lightly. And if you want to, just to give it a little bit more of a thorough clean. You can see that is actually evaporating. If you blow on it, it basically goes straight away. This one here, this is also underneath there. There are the VRMs. If you wanted to, you could undo that as well. Just check on the pads on there. Due to the fact that the pads on this particular model appear to be actually in pretty good shape, as hopefully you can see there. So yeah, they're in pretty good order. They're not cracking. They've still got some flexibility, and if you press them, they kind of do sponge up a little bit. So I think they're going to be absolutely fine. But we do want to remove this previous paste which is on there. So again, we're going to get our shop towel and remove the majority of it. And that's come off pretty well. Quite impressed with that. That's done well. Give it a little buff. And again, we're going to do the same thing again, just a tiny little bit of isopropyl alcohol there. And I will use the brush for cleaning teeth. Obviously don't use this brush again for cleaning teeth. It's not the most hygienic. This is an old one, as you can see. It's pretty damaged, so that's fine. So again, going to grab another clean towel and just give that a wipe off. And there we go. I think that is pretty decent, although we've taken off some of the barcode there. That was unfortunate, but never mind. And actually you can start to see now there is an exposed section of copper actually on that heat pipe. The rest of it is covered in nickel plated. And you can see that it's just come off there where it's flattened. And you can feel, actually, if you get your nail or something along there, you can actually, it does get stuck in there. So you are going to want a heat paste which does have a little bit of thickness to it, just to kind of bridge those gaps. So let's get on and put some thermal paste on here. Now for this particular application, we're going to be using this. This is the Noctua NTH2. Now, this was actually kindly sent in to us by Rick H, so thank you very much, Rick. This stuff I don't particularly like for using on CPU coolers because it does have a little bit of extra thickness. But for open or exposed cores, this stuff is absolutely great because it's a little bit thicker. So I'm going to put a decent sized line of it on there. And then we're going to try and squish that out a little bit so it covers the entirety of the die. As you can see, it's kind of quite thick and gloopy. But we're going to squish this down anyway when the cooler goes on top. So don't be too concerned if your application isn't perfectly smooth. So there we go, that's some pretty decent coverage. If for any reason you're slightly concerned and you think that maybe you haven't quite covered everything, as long as your thermal paste is not electrically conductive, as this one, if you want to be ultra sure, just a tiny little extra blob in the middle will be helpful, because when you apply pressure from the heatsink going on the top, that'll just basically spread out and fill any potential gaps that you may have created by actually using the spread method. So now we're ready to reassemble and get some testing done. Now the fun part for reassembly, I've actually put this on to something just to rise it up a little bit, because the back of the GPU normally raises up, so I've just got something to stack it on. So the actual section where you plug in your graphics card to the monitor, this end here, is off, slightly raised. If you have it flat on the surface, you'll find that the holes here, although they'll line up, they may not actually be pushed all the way through to the surface. Much like when you're doing the AM4 coolers and the backplate has a tendency to kind of come away from the back of the board. It's very much a similar principle. So I'm just going to get this started. Just a couple of little turns there just to get things started. A little bit difficult to show you because actually the camera is so close that it's actually getting in the way of my screwdriver. Now, if you're not too sure about these, what you can do is do a couple of reverse turns until you hear a click. There we go. I'll get a bit closer so you can hear the click. There we go. So once you heard the click, you can then do a couple of turns. And that way you'll know that the screw is actually threaded correctly. And for those of you that are completely novice to these things when it comes to unscrewing or screwing things up, essentially lefty-loosey, righty-tighty. So if you're turning towards the right-hand side, you're tightening. If you're turning to the left-hand side, you're loosening. So now we've got the screws in, we can go around and do them in order. So we'll do 1, 2, 1, 2 on that one, and then just do opposing corners. 1, 2, 1, 2, and then just repeat. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. And then again, just keep on going. So that's half a turn there pretty much. So hopefully this will be about half a turn. Maybe a little bit more. So that wasn't totally even. There's a quarter of a turn on that one and about half a turn on that one. So we weren't too far off. Essentially the springs in there are going to help and actually keep everything nice and together. And there we can see there is a finished product. You can, if you want to, obviously remove the fans, clean up the heatsink in there. That looks to be absolutely fine for me. So let's get this installed into the PC and next you'll be seeing some gameplay footage and hopefully some benchmark results. So let's look straight at the results. So we're going to Unigene Heaven first of all, 1080p. This has not done too bad actually, and kind of tells the tale for the rest of the results, to be completely honest with you. So we're looking at an average of 96.7 frames per second, and that generated a score of 2,435 points. Now this breaks down to a lowest FPS rating of 51.7 and a maximum of 197.5, which kind of pretty much translates to a lot of the rest of the games that you'll be seeing in this lineup. So let's take a look now at Timespy, another synthetic benchmark, and with this it runs pretty much as expected, and we had a result of 4,049 points, which gave us a legendary status. Happy days. But realistically, when it comes to synthetics, they don't always tell the full story. So let's take a look at some games now and see what it's actually like to use in real life. So let's start off with CSGO. This is running 1080p, high settings, and I've turned the anti-aliasing down to bilinear, and with this, pretty consistent overall actually, and in general we're looking at somewhere between about 160 to 200 FPS. Again, going back to the previous benchmark with Heaven where we were topping out at nearly 200 FPS, this is pretty much the same case here at 1080p high settings. Overall a very consistent experience, played very nicely, and when you consider the price of this, I think it's an excellent value for money, especially if CSGO is your thing. This is Cyberpunk 2077, this again 1080p, all of the tests here are going to be 1080p, and this is running at the medium preset, and we do have FSR enabled, although to be honest with you it doesn't seem to do a great deal for some reason. Maybe it's my settings, I'm not entirely sure, but in the gameplay we're looking at somewhere around the 45 frames per second as being our average, which is something we've seen relatively consistently in this game with similar graphics cards such as the RX580 SP2048 and other cards of a similar specification. Overall though, not too bad, and even in slightly more intense scenes such as gunfights, the frame rate did drop a little bit and there is the odd stutter here and there, but overall if you want to play Cyberpunk 2077 and you don't have a ton of cash, this potentially could be a good option for you. Now going back again to what we said earlier about the maximum frame rates here, we're looking pretty much the same here in Rocket League. So this is Rocket League, this is 1080p, high settings, and we're looking again averaging between 160 and 200 FPS. You get the occasional dip there here and there, but it's not too bad at all. It feels very smooth and very fluid. Although, having said that, having reduced the game a little bit later on in the settings down to 120 FPS as our frame rate cap, it did result in a much smoother experience, as you can see from the graphs in the top right of the screen. So this is showing your frame time consistency, and we're getting in the original setup in the red and the yellow quite frequently, but with the frame rate limited to 120 FPS, we're pretty much consistently in the green, and it does feel much more fluid. This game was actually really enjoyable, and we ended up winning the match, and I got MVP. Happy days. Next up, we're looking at War Thunder. So this is another one of the ones which have been asked for by some of you out there in Veerland. This runs actually not as well as I was expecting. So this again, 1080p, medium settings. We're getting a similar sort of thing as what we did with Cyberpunk. So we're looking around about the sort of 40, 45 frames per second, which actually in this, because it isn't a fast-paced, twitchy shooter, it actually works quite well and still looks very nice, a very smooth and consistent experience. If War Thunder is your game, and again, you don't want to spend a ton of money on a graphics card, then I think the Radeon RX470 4GB will do the job very nicely and is considerably better than any of the onboard graphics solutions currently available on the market. Now back to something which is a little bit more difficult to run, and actually this does show up the weaknesses in the RX470, unfortunately, especially at the very beginning of the game where you've got a lot of your AI characters or your other competitors all lined up. It does take a little bit of hit on that GPU. And as you can see here, we go from something like 30 to 40 FPS at the very start, but then when it evens out and when you get stretched out in the pack, it does become considerably more consistent, and you're looking anywhere between 60 to 100 FPS depending whereabouts you are, And with Wreckfest, as always, depending on the map itself and the terrain, this can differ wildly. But having said that, still a very, very nice experience, very playable. And again, if Wreckfest is your thing, 1080p medium isn't going to be a problem at all. Potentially you could crank it up to high if you wanted to. You wouldn't expect to see too much of a hit in performance there. Ultimately, it's going to be down to you and what you want to see, either higher frame rates or lower frame rates with slightly better visuals. With this 1080p medium, you can start to see where the image is kind of falling apart a little bit. Now for a AAA game of, well, actually very recent indeed. This is Dead Island 2. This is actually an AMD title, so you would expect it to shine here, and actually, bizarrely, it does. It actually does better than Wreckfest did. But we are taking advantage here of AMD's FSR technology. We've got this set to 1080p medium with FSR set to balanced, and with this we're getting somewhere between 80 to 100 FPS pretty much consistently, even when we're getting those big effects on screen. Although, again, like I've said previously, this game does kind of mitigate for those with those kind of slow-mo effects, which actually helps the graphics card to create all the particles on the screen. But overall, normal gameplay, feels very nice, very fluid, very playable, and I was actually quite surprised to see a AAA title like this run as well as it does. Although, like I said, this is an AMD-sponsored title, so you would expect it to do pretty good, even with a 6 to 7 year old graphics card. And last up, something which is predominantly an NVIDIA title, or at least seems to do much better on NVIDIA graphics cards. This is Fortnite. We're running Fortnite at 1080p, medium settings. We've got TSR set to medium, and our view distance is set to far rather than epic. I feel this gives a good balance of actually getting frame rates up, but still having a nice look to the game. This actually runs really nicely, anywhere between 80 and 100 FPS. Again, as always with Fortnite, it depends greatly where you are actually in the map. In more open spaces, you are going to see a bit of a performance hit, especially if there's lots of vegetation and also lighting effects. When you get slightly closer to the city or inside of a building, then obviously your frame rates are going to shoot up because there isn't that much actually to draw. So it does have its benefits in those more enclosed areas. But still, 80 to 100 FPS is what you should expect to see. And again, this was actually really good. I wasn't really paying a great deal of attention. I was looking at the figures and kind of not really paying attention to what was going on, and still managed to actually come second, and only came second because I managed to trap myself on the side of a mountain. Otherwise, potentially this could have been a win for me, but it certainly is a win for the RX470 anyway. So that pretty much wraps up my experiences with the Radeon RX470. Again, massive shout out to Skystalker for sending this over, and all it took was a quick BARS flash to get it back into its former glory from previously when it had a code 43. If you want to see more about that, the video will potentially be linked in the video description also if you want to check that out. I think overall this card, the way it actually does what it does, the fact that you have a 256-bit bus, I think is one of the saving graces of this particular design of card. The RX470 and RX480, the 570, 580, they're all in a very, very similar position. And at the moment when it comes to pricing, they're also very similarly priced. This particular card, if you want to pick up a used bargain from somewhere like CEX, if you're in the UK, you can pick up for somewhere in the region of about £50. If you want to spend a little bit of money and perhaps get the 8 gig version, then you can pick those up for around about £60. And of course, there's always the option of AliExpress, where there's often bargains like these under £50. So if you do want to spend a little bit longer with it in the post and potentially it not turn up at all, then that is always an option. But if you head to eBay, CEX, place like that, you should be able to pick one of these cards up for anywhere between £30 to £130. It does really vastly differ depending what model it is, quality, and sometimes the sellers just have no idea what prices are supposed to be these days, so they price them sky high and just hope and pray that someone buys them. And hopefully you don't. Hopefully you go to the links in the video description and pick one up nice and cheaply from eBay, because I think that is the best way of doing it. Alternatively, there's CEX with a potential 2-year warranty, although they only generally tend to give you back the market value of the card if it fails within the kind of towards the end of the 2 years. So yeah, don't expect to use it for 2 years and get your £50 back. It doesn't kind of work that way, unfortunately. But I think for £50 or so, it's a pretty decent gamble. And also the good thing is, if you're looking at building a new AM4 system at the moment, slightly more budget orientated, definitely get one of these cards instead of going for a G-series processor. With the G-series processors, you are going to be really hampered with that PCI Express Gen 3 and also only having a x8 bus available to you. So when you do want to upgrade and put a graphics card into your computer, if you've gone with a G-series processor, you are going to be kind of, well, stuck on very low bandwidth when it comes to it. Whereas if you picked up, say, a 5600 or 5600X rather than the 5600G, which potentially you could get similar prices, the 5600 or the 5600X is going to give you a much better time further down the road when you've got a little bit more money for a graphics card with that full PCI Express Gen 4 x16 bus available on your graphics card slot. Hopefully that makes sense. If it doesn't, you know what to do. Hit me up in the comments section below. But I think that's going to wrap this one up. I've been Mike. This is Mike's Unboxing Reviews and How To, and hopefully we'll catch you in the very next video. Thanks for watching.